This is Harvest Moon Homecoming, Sweet Haven Farm Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 1. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 4. Chapter 7.
Uncle Fink? Mom?
He broke the kiss, but this time he didn't drop her like she was on fire. He was the one on fire. He rested his forehead against hers, trying to regain a semblance of normalcy. "We should have expected that, right?" he whispered.
The kiss or the interruption?
She laughed, shakily. Her hands fell from his shoulders to his waist, but stayed there like she couldn't quite let go, or maybe needed the support. He certainly did, but her face was upturned, her blue eyes sparkled into his. He could get used to being around a woman with so much vivacity. Both? He slid his hands out from under her shirt, reluctantly. Her eyelids slid closed, and it was all he could do not to pull her back to him. But he forced himself to step away.
I suppose you two were discussing float ideas again?
Harper asked with not a little sarcasm. From the house, it sounded like they were killing each other, but we walk in and it looks like they'll be announcing wedding plans. Wyatt shrugged. Fink's eyes widened, and he turned. Was she as shocked at that statement as he? Her face had gone white, and she wouldn't meet his eyes. Yeah, that's what he thought. The kissing was a fluke. Ellie and he were not relationship material. How could people who were such polar opposites get along in a romantic relationship? Every time they were together, they fought like cats over a clothesline. Ellie pushed herself away from the wagon. She tugged the bottom of her shirt down. Fink's hand was halfway to her to help before he realized it. He ran it through his hair instead and turned around. Remembering the float, he asked, "So, Mrs. Bright, what do you want us to carry in for you?" She moved away from him to the back of the wagon and looked at it.
I'd say we need at least 10 bales of hay. Those are in the barn. Maybe 50 stalks of corn.
She looked at Harper.
Is there any of that pretty green dent Indian corn left? I can check. If we have any, bring 10 ears or so, and some of the regular Indian corn.
Fink reached around her for his briefcase. She was rattling this stuff off, and he couldn't shake the need to make a list. He took out a notepad and pen. She slid sideways and crossed her arms over her chest as though in self-defense, and he couldn't blame her. He breathed in the scent of pine and passion that he would forever associate with her. He tapped his pen on the paper. So, 10 bales of hay, 50 stalks of corn, 10 ears of green Indian corn, and some regular Indian corn. Anything else?
I'll get string and scissors,
Ellie said. He jotted those down, too.
Also, we'll carry pumpkins and gourds from the fields. The gourds can go in a bushel basket, with 2 people carrying it between them. That's a lot more efficient than trying to make 100 trips, dropping them the whole way. Wyatt and I will get the corn, and we'll use the 4-wheeler for the hay bales. If you two can keep from fighting
and kissing, Wyatt added.
If your uncle can keep his hands off me.
Ellie threw the words over her shoulder as she moved the hammer and nails out of the way. He paused, his pen in midair. If you can keep from throwing yourself at me.
I most certainly did no such thing.
If I hadn't caught you, you'd have drilled your nose into the floor.
Of all the arrogant, no good, nasty things, Mother.
Harper sounded like the parent. She must have the patience of a saint to live with that woman. Fink put his list and pen into his briefcase and set it on a shelf. Harper handed Ellie the bushel basket.
Can you and Mr. F get the gourds and pumpkins?
If he can keep his mouth shut, it won't be a problem, Ellie mumbled.
Turn on the floodlights when you go out, please,
she said to Harper as Harper disappeared out the door. Fink reached for the basket. I'll carry it.
Fine.
Ellie, he placed a hand gently on her arm. She stopped, but kept her head bowed. Could we maybe be friends? She swallowed. He shuffled his feet and resisted the urge to rub her arm. His palm heated and little tingles ran up his arm while he waited, breathless, for her to speak. Why was her answer so important to him? Looking up, she gave him a little smile and nodded. He smiled back, wanting to step forward and, kiss her again? Friends, Fink. Instead, he said, Come on, show me where the great gourd patch is. She laughed.
It's not far, I promise.
Ellie adjusted the twine on the cornstalks and reached for the scissors. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. She hadn't set them there. On a normal day, when she worked alone, nothing was ever where it belonged. She'd spend more time looking for the dang things than actually using them. Not today. She snipped the twine, then stopped and looked around. The gourds were organized by size and shape, the pumpkins arranged neatly on the floor. Fink had zero artistic abilities. She half suspected he might even be colorblind, but he was unequaled as a project manager. She tossed the scissors aside, like she normally would, to test a new hypothesis that had just dawned in her brain. Casually, she said,
A girl could get used to this.
Huh? Fink looked up from the notebook he was writing in.
Nothing. What are you writing now?
Just keeping track of how much of your stuff goes on the wagon. I want to make sure we pay you for everything. He set the notebook aside and moved the scissors and twine to the edge of the wagon, just like she thought he would. She grinned. He didn't notice since he looked back at the notebook and made another mark in it. She might have done most of the hands-on work, but Fink had been the wind that had allowed her kite to fly.
You don't need to. It's our school, too.
After twisting the twine tight, she tied a knot, then stepped back to check out her handiwork. I can't pay you for the time, but there's still some money in the budget for the float. You should get something out of this.
Hand me that one, please.
She pointed to a large pumpkin on the floor about the same size as the one she'd placed on the opposite side of the wagon. After handing it up, he went back and closed the gap removing it had left. It's looking pretty good.
I think we're almost finished.
It was hard to believe she could almost say she enjoyed working with Fink, but not as much as she enjoyed kissing him. Warmth spread through her chest at the thought. Her cheeks heated and she directed her attention to the wagon display. Hay bales, cornstalks, pumpkins, and gourds, arranged artistically but nothing spectacular. They certainly wouldn't be winning first prize for best float. She tamped down her irritation. Not putting her best effort into making a super great, creative float gave her a nasty feeling in the pit of her stomach, like she was being lazy or sloppy. She didn't like to see those qualities in herself. Maybe it was the inferiority complex she had from never getting her diploma, but she always pushed herself to excel in everything she did. A school float was no different. Plus, art was her passion. If she had the time, she could make a spectacular float. But obviously the right decision was to bow to Fink's desire to get it done quickly, although a part of her wished they weren't finished. She didn't mind. No, she actually enjoyed spending time with Fink. Shockingly, she was disappointed there would be no need to see him tomorrow night. He stood back, arms planted on his hips. "Hop down and look at it from back here." She jumped down and walked toward him. He checked his watch. Wow, 2 a.m. Where does the time go?
Glad we sent the kids up. What time was that? 11?
Something like that. He waved his arm at the decked-out wagon. "This is amazing. I have no idea how you took string and vegetables and turned them into something so beautiful." His voice lowered and he smiled tenderly. "That takes talent." She shrugged, ignoring the warmth in her chest. She almost felt like he was admiring her instead of her work.
Lots of people can do stuff like that. It's no big deal.
It's a big deal to people who can't.
Thanks for your help.
The uncomfortable sense that he had begun to see her as someone of worth rather than the woman perpetually late for school unsettled her stomach. She wasn't sure she wanted Fink to notice her at all. Instinctively, she knew that way lay heartache. For her. Plus, someone like Fink wasn't supposed to notice someone like her.
I didn't have to search for my scissors once, which is unprecedented for sure.
Organization is one of my talents. He smiled, handsome in a way a school principal had no right being, and her heart thumped. The smile lit his face up, his square jaw flexed, and his eyes crinkled. "I think we work pretty well together. I suppose there's a reason opposites attract." Her face froze. His eyes widened. Had he just admitted to being attracted to her? Seconds ticked by as they stared at each other. "So,
yeah."
Ellie shook her head and walked back to the wagon to gather her twine and scissors. Fink cleared his throat. Do you want these extra gourds and pumpkins carried back out?"
No, they're fine.
She walked to the door, then paused to wait for him to grab his briefcase and walk between the neatly piled gourds and the line of pumpkins. She stuck out her hand. His brows lifted.
Thanks. It really was a pleasure, surprisingly, to work with you.
She tilted her head and grinned. Man, she couldn't believe she was actually going to miss him. He shook her hand firmly. "It was an honor to work with you as well." His hand squeezed hers before he dropped it. "I have the list of materials we used. You get me prices, and I'll make sure the farm gets a check." She flipped the lights off, and he shut the door behind them. For one small moment, she wondered what it would be like to walk home with this man every night, to have the companionship of someone who bolstered her weaknesses, to share kisses like they had earlier. She'd never experienced passion that explosive. She sighed into the crisp fall darkness. Fink was pretty serious, an academic. He wouldn't be interested in someone like her. She wouldn't have thought she would be interested in someone like him. But she kind of was. Interested. Too bad he'd probably faint if he found out. Wednesday morning, Fink squealed the tires as he pulled into the parking lot. The only spaces available were at the far end. He pulled in, not even caring that his car was crooked, and took up 2 spots. He grabbed his briefcase and shot out of the car, feeling bare without a tie or a jacket. But he'd barely gotten Wyatt and himself up at all. Calling in sick had been tempting. Wyatt jogged beside him across the parking lot. "I'll take care of your late notice. Just get a pass from Mrs. Herschel and go straight to class," he said as their feet thumped on the blacktop. Wyatt mumbled something that was drowned out by the familiar roar of a muffler-less pickup. Although, today, the pickup slowed down as it pulled in. The tires didn't squeal and all four stayed on the ground. Wyatt and he jogged beside it as it slowed in front of the school, staying off the sidewalk. Harper waved and smiled. Probably she didn't know what to do with her hands, since she didn't have to hold on for dear life to keep her head from cracking against the windows. Fink stopped at the front door and held it open, waiting on Harper and Ellie to get out and walk in. Wyatt walked through the first set of doors and grabbed the second one. This was getting to be a habit. "Good morning, Harper. Ellie." Man, he loved saying her name. Her cheeks turned red. It took him a second to notice that not only was she dressed in jeans and a fitted t-shirt, but her hair, well, he wouldn't say it was under control, but she had attempted to tame it into a thick braid that lay down the middle of her back. Frizzy pieces escaped, but they only served to frame her face. Ellie was slender, with curves in the exact right places, adorable pink cheeks, fascinating blue eyes, and those lips. She bit one now as she stood in front of him, and he couldn't drag his eyes away. A strange twinge hit his chest, heating up his insides. He shook his head and moved his gaze over her head. "Stupid man, pay attention to where you are." "I'll take care of your note this morning, Ellie. I think I've seen your signature enough times that I can get it right." Something white waved in front of his face. "Are you sleepwalking? I just said I had the note, already written out and signed." He took the piece of paper. Man, she tied him up in knots. No, he just wasn't getting enough sleep. That was the problem. "Thanks." One glance told him that Harper and Wyatt had disappeared. "You, look nice today." What had he just said? He clamped down on his tongue. Too late. She smiled. Her entire face lit up, and he racked his brain for something else to say to keep that smile on her face. Without a word, she reached up. He couldn't move. The world had shrunk to just her, looking at him. Her fingers brushed his neck. Scalding hot. He swallowed. The sides of his throat stuck together. He swallowed again. Her short breaths puffed on his skin. Minty, warm. His heart seemed to beat all over his body. His skin felt cool, then clammy. He almost jumped in surprise when the top button on his shirt popped out of its hole. But he held himself completely still, not wanting to break eye contact, not wanting to lose the ambient magic. "You'll be more comfortable that way," she whispered. Her hands started to move back, but he captured her wrists and held them still. For what? He didn't know. Her bones felt small in his hands, delicate, not what he'd expected. He rubbed his thumbs on the insides of her wrists. She worked so hard and had accepted life, determined to be content and happy. He wanted her to be happy. "Hey, Mr. F., are you Jordan stuck his head out the first set of doors. Thankfully, Fink was partially turned so his back hid most of Ellie, but he opened his hands and released her arms. What was he thinking? They were on school property. Anyone could see. She took 2 steps back, then another. Her smile was gone. She spun on her heel and power-walked around her truck before jumping into the cab and cranking on the motor. Soon she was gone in a blast of noise and a cloud of blue smoke. His heart continued to pound like crazy, and his fingers caressed his collar like he could still feel hers on it. Ellie, Mrs. Bright, had touched him tenderly, and he'd reacted like a puppy rolling over on the floor with all four paws in the air and its tongue hanging out. He should be ashamed that he had such little self-control. But he wasn't. Rather, he wanted to run to his car and take off after her, making sure she wasn't angry with him for letting her go, that she hadn't gotten the wrong idea, that she knew he... What? He liked her? He admired her? Respected her? Crazy chaos. This was Mrs. Bright, perpetually late, chronically disorganized, child mother. He scrubbed a hand over his face. Did any of that matter? She had some bad habits, so did he, but the unselfish, caring, funny person under it all had charmed him. She excelled in areas where he lacked. He had a sneaking suspicion their personalities would complement each other perfectly. Maybe he could convince her to give them a try. There had to be an excuse to see her again. Mr. F? Jordan still had his head stuck out the door, while Fink stood staring at the empty road. No smoke from her exhaust remained. He turned slowly and walked into the school. Yes, son? Was that Harper's mom? Yes. Late again, huh? Jordan stopped in the hall. Not really. Oh, well, okay. I just wanted to know if you were lifting after school today with us. The float is done and I should be back on schedule. A life spent with Ellie would probably never run on schedule. Whoa. Where did that thought come from? He wasn't considering spending his life with anyone, especially Mrs. Bright. Okay, I'll look for you tonight then. Jordan waved and strode off. Fink stood in the hall, bemused. He had to face it. He was attracted to Ellie Bright. Somehow, she'd pushed through all the barriers he'd set up in his life, barriers he'd established with the express purpose of keeping himself far from any hint of sexual scandal that could ruin his career. She'd blown right through them. But currently, he had the superintendent position to consider. He didn't want his conduct to jeopardize that in any way. He forced his feet to move, greeting Mrs. Herschel before walking into his office. Several papers sat on his desk, and he got busy working through them until a knock sounded on his door. He startled. Usually Mrs. Herschel announced visitors. As he stood, he stacked the remaining papers into a pile in the exact center of his desk and glanced at the glass. His brow furrowed. What was the president of the school board doing in his office? Chapter 8. Dr. Rothschild, I wasn't expecting you. Please come in. Dr. Rothschild gave Fink a professional smile and walked in, her heels clicking on the tile. Her perfume, fancy and cloying, hung in the air. He longed for the fresh scent of pine. He shook his head and looked to make sure someone was behind the desk in the main office. Mrs. Herschel was on the phone, but she smiled and waved. Please, sit down. He adjusted one of the chairs, which was out of line with the corner of his desk. Thank you. She perched on the edge of her seat. Every piece of her shiny brown hair was perfectly in place. Her face revealed nothing of her thoughts. Even her outfit, a short navy skirt and white blouse, said professional. It's a pleasure to see you. Forgive him the white lie. What can I do for you?
She blinked and tisked as she opened her mouth. I'm sorry I didn't call first, but I just got off the phone with several out-of-town guests who are coming to see our Little Farmer's Day parade.
Her glossy red lips pulled back, exposing perfect white teeth. He supposed it was a smile.
I know you are supervising our float, and since these guests have rather deep pockets.
She lifted a brow, making sure he understood these guests were rich, not just rich.
And they are thinking of moving their families to our little school district. Of course, they are interested in our academics. However,
she allowed the caveat to hang in the air as her cool blue eyes assessed him. He resisted the urge to squirm. Pasting a pleasant smile on his face, he adjusted the small stack of papers on his desk, then steepled his fingers over them, waiting for her to continue. She inhaled through her nose as though smelling something unpleasant.
You do realize that ours is a small district. Few students mean less funding from the state. The two families I spoke with on the phone today have the means to make substantial donations. Donations that could pay for things like new lights and bleachers for the football field, an upgrade to our PA system, a new floor in the gymnasium.
She looked down her sharp nose at the cheap veneer on his desk.
New office furniture for the staff.
Silence descended upon the office, broken only by the slow ticking of his large wall clock. Must be his turn to speak. I am in complete agreement with you. What is it that you want me to do? He could entertain these families for the weekend. There were lots of things to do around town. He could take them to Ellie's farm for an evening, pick out pumpkins, have a hayride, s'mores around a campfire. A genuine smile broke out on his face. Dr. Rothschild's brows drew together.
I'm so happy to see that you understand the possibilities of this opportunity.
The woman didn't look happy. Fink nodded anyway, and tried to school his features into a more professional demeanor.
The families will be touring the grounds on Friday. You will eat lunch with them in the staff lounge, but other board members and I will guide their tour.
She paused, and he could only assume it was for dramatic effect.
You are in charge of the school float for the parade Saturday evening?
Yes. He almost added, it's finished, but before he could, she spoke again.
I do hope you have put some serious effort into it. I'm expecting it to look fabulous, different, and better from every other float in the parade.
She stared pointedly at Fink. Fink forced his constricted lungs to take in air. Why, oh why, hadn't he listened to Ellie?
I suspect your float might already be finished. I understand that it would be a horrible inconvenience for you to improve upon your design this close to the parade. I also realize there is a vote next Wednesday on the superintendent position at the regular school board meeting, and your name is on the ballot. If the two families visiting us this weekend were to decide to move to our district, I'm certain the results of the vote would please you greatly.
Her eyes drilled into him.
But if our school district disappoints in any way,
I understand. And actually, he did. Schools were about students and educating them, but they were also a business, mixed with politics. It made sense that a principal who could attract money to the school would also be a superintendent who would attract money to the school. A small part of him was aghast at the threat Dr. Rothschild had just barely veiled behind her loaded assumptions. A larger part of him wanted to meet the challenge. Every part of him wanted to work with Ellie again. He leaned back in his chair, smiling, confident. He already had the perfect design for the float. I will alert the janitorial staff. The school and grounds will be pristine on Friday.
I will find room in the budget for overtime.
The students are always well behaved, but I will convey the importance of Friday's visitors to our teachers as well.
Perfect.
And the float will be stunning, an inspired work of art. Dr. Rothschild drew her lips back.
I knew I could count on you, Mr. Finkenbinder.
Always. She stood and held out her hand. He thought about bowing and kissing her knuckles, but he shook it instead, then opened the door and escorted her out. As she walked through the double doors, he glanced at his watch. Lunchtime. He never left the school during the day. Ever. But today, he'd make an exception. Ellie hummed as she pushed the miniature white pumpkin down on the sharpened dowel rod, nestling it among the feathered corn tassels. It contrasted with the brown grapevine wreath structure and deep purple ribbon. Purple had been the most popular color this year. She hadn't always thought of it as a fall color, but obviously someone did. She twisted the pumpkin, adjusting the angle of the stem. A little touch of green would really make this wreath pop. Where had she set that ivy? Not on the work table. Not under it. Not on the counter by the cash register. If only Fink were here to keep her organized. Ah, Fink. He'd looked so handsome this morning. She'd forgotten what rough stubble felt like on her fingers. Had she ever known? She certainly had never felt that tingle in her hand, the swirling of heat in her stomach, the feeling of rightness in her soul. She picked up a section of ribbon lying on the table. Watching it shimmer in the light, she twirled in the small space between the work table and the wall, observing it ripple and undulate in the air, dancing in the small space to keep it waving. The shop bells tinkled as the door opened. Her foot caught on the doormat. She knocked a can of corn kernels over as she grabbed at the table to keep from falling. They crashed to the floor and splattered. Capable hands seized her waist, preventing her fall, helping her stand, steadying her. Fink. Her eyes widened.
I was just thinking of you.
Yes? He asked without releasing her.
Finishing this wreath.
She indicated the purple ribboned wreath, which had escaped her near fall unscathed. His familiar spicy scent teased her nose. Beautiful, he said. She shivered and whispered.
You didn't even look at it.
Look at what? His gaze dropped to her lips, which she suddenly realized were dry. She touched her tongue to them. His fingers tightened on her waist.
The wreath.
What wreath?
The one I was just finishing. You said it was beautiful, but you didn't even look at it.
I wasn't talking about the wreath. She swallowed.
What were you talking about?
He opened his mouth. She moved closer. Shaking his head as though waking from a dream, he stepped back, dropping his hands from her, shoving them in his pockets. He leaned a shoulder against the open door. I have a huge favor to beg of you. She leaned a hip against the table. Her knees were not overly steady just yet.
I just realized you should be in school. Did you get fired?
He snorted. No, not yet.
Not yet.
He took a deep breath, as though needing to focus his thoughts. You know, I've applied for the superintendent position.
Yes.
Well, in order for me to secure the position, we need to improve the float. I should have listened to you to begin with, and I'm sorry. He met her eyes. I was hoping you would help me do the first design, the one I have the picture for.
Last time, my idea was a complete disaster.
She fingered the ribbon in her hand, looking down at it. We didn't have directions. I've got to go back to school, but I can see if I can find something on the internet, or maybe the shop teacher, Mr. Woods, might be able to draft me something up. She looked up.
So you're asking me, not demanding that I do this to keep my daughter out of detention?
He paused, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets and meeting her eyes. Humbly. I'm asking, as a friend, for a favor.
I have an interview with a potential employee scheduled for tonight at 7:30, but after that, I'll do everything I can to help you.
Thanks. I owe you. Caught in his eyes, she couldn't look away, couldn't answer, but she knew her face was shining with a full-on smile. She'd be seeing him again tonight. They'd be working together. She felt like twirling her ribbon again, but resisted the impulse. She'd wait until he left. Well, I'd better get back to the school. I'll be out this evening. 8?
Yes.
He made no move to leave. Every beat of her heart filled her chest with fervor until it threatened to burst. He pulled his hands out of his pockets and clenched them at his sides. She twined the ribbon through her fingers. He took a step closer. Excitement shimmered in her chest. She leaned toward him. He closed the distance between them. His hands slid up her cheeks, moving into her hair. His scent surrounded her. Tingles pulsed on her skin. Her knees quivered and her heart rate soared. Time seemed to stop and the world shrank to only them as she touched her tongue to her dry lips. Fink seemed mesmerized by the movement. Keeping his eyes fixed on her lips, he said, I thought I might kiss you goodbye. She gave a shallow nod, but it was all he needed. He pressed his lips to hers. Just a touch, but sensation rocketed through her body. He dropped his hands, spun on his heel, and was gone before she opened her eyes. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.